As the temps start rising, I feel that familiar urge to refresh my closet, but I don't want to waste money on pieces I'll only wear once or just for one season. Quince changes that. Their clothes are timeless, lightweight, and far more elevated than anything else at this price. It finally feels like my wardrobe matches my standards. By working directly with top artisans and cutting out the middlemen, Quince gives you luxury without the markup. And Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes. I recently got one of the European linen tanks to be able to stay cool throughout the summer while working and looking professional. So give your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
The influence and authority of van der Kolk and some of his peers are the main reason that people are not getting the highest quality treatment for PTSD. This effect on the culture cannot be overstated. And since the piece has come out, I've gotten so many emails from psychology professors and people who train therapists that tell me, like, we basically have to have a section on doing what people have learned from this book before people are even amenable to learning about these evidence-based techniques.
That was Emmy Nietfeld on Psychologists Off the Clock.
We are 5 experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, author of Act for Burnout and Act Daily Journal.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and the author of an upcoming book on developing your confidence and social skills.
From Boston, I'm Dr. Yael Schoenbrunn, faculty at Brown University and author of Work, Parent, Thrive, and an upcoming book about misunderstanding.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Hi, everyone. This is Debbie, and I'm here with Jill to introduce our episode for today with Emmy Nietfeld, who has written a terrific memoir called Acceptance. And this is part 2 of our PTSD and trauma series. And so if you haven't already listened to part 1, which is with Robin Walzer on ACT for PTSD, because we really get into some of the nuts and bolts of trauma work. And I think it really sets the stage for this episode. And they're a nice pair together, but I think that will provide you with the foundation. And then you can listen to this conversation about Emmy's experience as someone with trauma and also someone who went through some trauma treatment. And Jill, I'm curious what your thoughts are about the interview.
Well, I loved that you did this as a series. I think it makes so much sense. And I loved this interview with Emmy, especially because you guys really dive into The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, which has been on the New York Times bestseller list for a zillion years, 5 or 6 years or something. But there are a lot of problems with that book. And what I think I loved most about both of these episodes is you really do debunk a lot of myths. What I did find myself wondering, what I really want to know, so I have not read Emmy's memoir yet, and I'm definitely planning to read it after listening to the episode, but I thought maybe for other listeners who haven't yet read it, maybe you could set the stage a little bit about Emmy's story and like why she wrote this memoir and what she was struggling with specifically that led her to seek out trauma treatment.
Yeah, so Emmy had a really tough early childhood. Her dad left, and so she lived with her mother, who had an extreme hoarding disorder and was really unable to take care of her and keep her safe and meet her basic needs. And so Emmy was in and out of foster care and group homes and was homeless for a while and just in all kinds of really tough situations throughout childhood and adolescence. So there was that sort of chronic stress and chronic trauma, like repeated trauma over the years, complex PTSD, as we would call it. And then when she was a young adult, she was traveling in Europe and she had a sexual assault experience, which was sort of her acute trauma. And so she had sort of the double whammy of this really tough, all these adverse events in her childhood and then this acute sexual assault trauma. And so we kind of allude to both throughout the interview, but I'm glad you asked that question because it's important to understand where she was coming from.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you talk a lot about how in an effort to improve her life, her situation, she sought out therapy. And, you start in the beginning before she found prolonged exposure therapy. She tried a lot of other therapies and the therapies and the therapists were not helpful. I do want to say to listeners that I hope those early experiences she's had with therapy don't discourage you from seeking therapy. I think what's really important is that you have to find the right help at the right time. And Emmy did that. I mean, she knew all along that being told she should do yoga or being told she has to talk about her childhood for 10 years before she can talk about her trauma, she knew that that wasn't the right thing for her. And she ultimately did land in the right place. But we had Stephanie Fu on to talk about her trauma memoir about complex PTSD, What My Bones Know, and people can go back and listen to that. And she similarly had quite a few misses before she found her hit. And that is the reality of what can happen. And it can be hard and frustrating. But I just encourage people to persist and persevere because even though it's a difficult system to navigate, when you find good evidence-based help with the right therapist, it is absolutely life-changing.
Well, and I think this is part of what makes Emmy actually an interesting voice in this space. She's speaking up and writing very publicly about her experience with mental health treatment. And it was a mixed bag. And some of it was kind of forced upon her at a young age when she didn't have a whole lot of control. And even that was a mixed bag. She had some good experiences and some less good experiences. And then as an adult, she had to kind of seek it out. And so I think she's an interesting voice because she's seen it be really effective and helpful. And she's had some great people along the way and some not so great. So she's someone who really kind of knows what's out there and I think can offer some valid criticisms, but also has found it helpful.
Absolutely. And, it's funny, I had the same thought with both her and Stephanie. At the very end, Emmy says something like, I really wanted to live. I didn't want to focus so much on reducing my symptoms. I wanted to live. And I thought, this is why we love ACT, because ACT focuses on living and values even in the presence of pain. And then there's often this lovely byproduct that the pain does get better, but it's not the focus. And, ACT is also exposure therapy, but with that values piece. And I found myself thinking, oh, if Emmy needs more therapy, I hope she finds ACT because I think it would be a perfect fit for her. And I remember having the exact same thought about Stephanie. And it turned out she and I chatted about it and she had never heard of it. And so I got to introduce ACT to Stephanie as well. So I don't know if she's looked into that more, but
I felt the same way about Emmy. I was actually like, I kind of want to be Emmy's therapist, but that's, kind of a weird reference. I feel like yes, I feel the same way. Like and actually sometimes I'm listening to an interview of a celebrity or something like that, or on a podcast. I'm like, I think this person must do ACT therapy because of the way they're talking. Who knows if they actually are or not?
Who knows? Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, I digress. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Emmy Nietfeld. Emmy Nietfeld is an author, journalist, and speaker. She's the author of Acceptance, a memoir of her journey through foster care and homelessness, which interrogates the true meanings of resilience, ambition, and success. A dynamic, sought-after speaker, she can be found on podcasts, leading conference keynotes, and speaking at universities and companies alike. Her essays have appeared in the New York Times, New York Magazine, The Atlantic, and other publications have been nominated for the Pushcart Prize, noted in the Best American Essays, and taught in classrooms from high schools to MFA programs. She's published essays recently in Mother Jones and Slate about her experience with trauma treatment, which offer a critique of the book, The Body Keeps the Score. We'll be talking about those essays today, and we'll link to them in the show notes for this interview. Emmy, welcome. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here, Debbie.
I'm really thrilled that you're here. I'm in that funny situation where I feel like I know you so well because I've read your entire memoir, so I know your whole life story. It's a little one-sided. But I'm really excited to talk to you today because of the perspective that you offer as someone who has been in mental health treatment for years and who also has some really important criticisms, I think, to offer the world. And so my hope is that a lot of people will listen to this conversation, especially therapists who I think could have done a lot better for you along the way in terms of the support you actually needed. And I think that you're going to offer us some lessons that therapists should really pay attention to. So I'm very grateful that you are coming on the podcast today.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be here. I'm a big fan.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So I devoured your memoir. I just read the whole thing in a couple of days. You have a really astounding story where, I hate to nutshell a complicated history, but you grew up in really pretty dire circumstances. Your parents weren't really capable of meeting your needs as a kid. And then you end up, going to Harvard, getting a big job at Google. It seems like you're doing great nowadays. You have this memoir. And so you've been held up as an example of resilience, right? Like publicly held up as an example of resilience. But I think what's unique about your memoir is that you write about some of the problems with the concept of resilience, right? Like I think sometimes at the surface, these stories, they're so inspiring and it's like, you can do this and hard work and so on. So could you just speak a little bit about what are some of the downsides of that kind of resilience model, in your opinion?
I grew up during peak grit culture with the Angela Duckworth TED Talk, where there were all of these programs like in Flint, Michigan during the water crisis. They had these behavioral scientists on the ground before kids even had safe drinking water, trying to teach them that they could, through like the power of their will, overcome being poisoned. And I shouldn't say I was constantly being held up as an example of resilience, right? When I was 14, I was sent to a residential treatment center. I would go on to go to foster care after that. And I had left like a really difficult home situation with a parent who was a hoarder and another parent who was gone and just serious mental illness. And the message that I always got was basically, you can control how you feel and your actions, and you just need to be tougher. And I think that that is such a toxic message to be sending to people who are in really difficult circumstances. And those are the people who are really being told you need to be resilient. I think in recent years, there has been a big backlash, especially from young people and Gen Z and Gen Alpha. And I think that because we had all of these messages about resilience that really were not rooted in reality, people are kind of like, okay, that concept is BS, and we're not going to think about it at all, which I think is also really, really awful.
Yeah. And I think that you really do pay attention to the context and how for a lot of people, there's a pretty thin line, right, between resilience and, I think you say in the book, resilience and desperation, right?
Yeah.
So people could look at you from the outside and tell a certain story of how you grew up, but your experience was just someone who was trying to survive in the world,
Yeah. I often get asked by people like, how did you do it? How did you get out? Because I was dealing with homelessness the summer before my senior year of high school. And I was studying for the SAT while sleeping in the backseat of my car or crashing on a million friends' different sofas. And I think a lot of people really are looking for like some life hack, like something that, okay, if I could do this, then any young person who's in a similar situation, they can do it too. Like they can go to Harvard. And the reality of it is a lot more complicated, which is part of why my book is so long. And when you look at the research behind resilience, like if you ask moms, how lovable is your baby? That is a huge indicator of how resilient that person will be when they're older. And so much of it really is like, okay, does this person have adults who care about them? And we think about resilience as a individual attribute, as like a character trait, when there's so much evidence that it is about being in community and having those like social emotional supports.
Well, and as a parent and a therapist, I was really attuned to that throughout your book, how the adults in your life, certainly your parents, but also so many of the mental health professionals you came in contact with along the way really didn't, I think, support you enough or in the right way. And one of the ways in which I think the mental health system failed you was that kind of blame the victim. You were sort of pathologized, you were put in residential treatment. The responsibility was really on you. And sadly, I think that's maybe not uncommon. Could you say a few words about that? Like, what was missing in terms of your context?
Yeah, I was going to therapists starting right after my parents divorced. I was consistently in therapy, first family therapy, then individual therapy. And I remember the very first session, my mom took me to the psychologist and told him all about my problems. Like, my daughter's disorganized. She's chronically late. I think she has ADD. And, my parents had just gotten a divorce. The person who had been my primary caretaker had moved across the country, and we would never speak again. And my mom herself had very severe, like untreated ADHD and probably other issues. And my mom was talking about me, and I told him, I was like, you need to come to see our house. Like, just come and see that there's piles of junk on every single surface. Like, we're walking through these narrow paths. And if you just see that, you'll understand. And he didn't. That's not what psychologists do in America. And for years, I was telling adults that, like, look at this bigger context. But that was not the job that they were supposed to play. And when Child Protective Services got involved, there was this reality of like, actually, you don't want to be taken into state custody, county custody, and that it's really hard when you have parents who have a mental illness and the child is the person who shows up to get treated. And so I think that the people who really actually helped me and who were able to cut through that were people who were real with me and who were like, hey, there's serious issues going on at home. You need to get out of there. And they saw that context and they listened to what I was asking for, where I was like, I have to get out of here by going to college. And I knew that was going to be my way out. But most of the people were like, no, you need to look at your trauma. Like, no, you need to have better coping skills. And I was like, no, I need a good SAT score so I can leave and then deal with my problems someplace where I'll be safe.
Yeah, it was really interesting to read about how for you getting into college was like survival. That was your way out, and I was aware of the title Acceptance for your memoir. And it was like, we think of emotional acceptance and accepting the situation, but it was also acceptance to college, that was and so you're trying to study for the ACTs in treatment programs in the car just to get yourself to a better situation.
Yeah. I hated it when therapists were like, you need to accept your situation. Like the DBT framework of, acceptance is why you're suffering. The fact you don't accept. And I was like, I should not be accepting this situation. I need a different one.
Yeah, that's right.
And sometimes that seems obvious, but in that situation, it evidently was not.
Well, I highlighted a passage in your book, and this was toward the end. Actually, this kind of came up throughout, which is you were applying for jobs in the tech world, and you realized, here's the quote, that you had not been catastrophizing, that in our winner-take-all world, and basically, to paraphrase, like, again, this idea that when you come into therapy, it's like, oh, change your thoughts, have a more positive attitude, and that kind of thing. And I think when you're in a circumstance like that, which so many people are, like, you can't positive think your way out of a situation like that, right? And so I imagine that may have felt invalidating.
Absolutely. Yeah. And also it just didn't help me deal with the reality that I was facing, which that's what I needed therapy to be.
Right. You needed to fix the situation and get to a better place with more support, not fix your thoughts about what was happening, right?
Yeah. Totally.
And so then in your 20s, I think it was like your mid-20s, you returned to therapy and you wanted to address trauma. You had been sexually assaulted as a teenager when you were traveling around Europe. And that is something that you carried with you all those years. And you went into therapy, and the therapist that you saw really stopped you from thinking about the memories that you had been trying to avoid out of fear that it would re-traumatize you. What did the therapist want you to do instead, and what was your reaction to that?
Yeah, she was like really stopping me, where I came in and I was like, I think that if I just tell someone the story, I will immediately feel better. And spoiler alert, when I eventually did, I did feel much better right away. But she was like, we don't have the alliance. We need to have a strong therapeutic alliance first. And that might take 5 to 10 years. And we need to talk about your childhood first. We need to go through all this other stuff first. And you have to be able to talk about what happened in this assault without being upset. Because if you're upset, that will just re-traumatize you. And in hindsight, it's like, okay, I'm never going to be able to talk about it without being upset. Like, that's not even a good goal because that's dehumanizing to my own experience. But she did recommend this book, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. And she recommended a lot of the methods in there, like yoga, acupuncture, singing. She wanted to hypnotize me. I was compulsively working out to help deal with the symptoms of PTSD. And she was like, that's great. Keep doing that. Like, you're working out 2 hours a day. Awesome. That metabolizes trauma. And, I think that there's a set of tools that seems to really help people who don't want to talk about what happened to them. And I don't think anybody who doesn't want to share what happened should be pushed into it. And on the other hand, it's very different to have somebody who's been the victim of violence, who wants to talk about it and say, actually, don't share that with me. I don't want to hear about it. And she would actually like flinch and recoil whenever I brought something up, which just made it 10 times worse.
So I want to circle back later in this conversation to your experience with prolonged exposure therapy. But I just want to stop right here and highlight something, which is that you came to therapy being really disturbed by these memories that were just unwanted, but showing up all the time, wanting to talk about them, wanting to process those memories. And you were basically told not to until all these things happened. And so when I did my trauma training, I worked at the VA for years and years and years as a VA intern. I trained in evidence-based trauma treatments, which all pretty much included an exposure component. I think most effective trauma treatments do have some sort of exposure component. And of course, like you're saying, and I just want to really highlight this, if someone is not consenting to do exposure work around traumatic memories, we don't do it. We might encourage them to consider doing that as a way of healing, but we're not forcing anyone. But we're also not wanting to avoid it, right? And I think I saw this a lot of times when I was in the VA system, which is that some people were really reluctant to do it. Therapists were. I think they were afraid, like, am I going to make my client worse? Are we going to talk about things that are so painful and scary? And sometimes I think like that was the most important thing someone needed to do. And yet the therapist would steer them away from it. And so I just want to pause there and just really emphasize this. You were ready to do this and you were discouraged.
Yeah. From the way that she reacted, I think it made her deeply uncomfortable because, I would share things and she would have this very visceral reaction to it, which in hindsight feels totally inappropriate for a therapist. That if there's something that is really triggering for her, like, we're not a good fit. And like, why would you agree to see a patient in that situation?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, hearing about trauma can be hard for a therapist. Like, it's upsetting. Of course it is. But your job is to sort of be there for your client and hold space. And if you can't do that, I think you're right. You'd need to maybe refer to a therapist who is able to provide that.
Yeah. Because and I think it was really challenging for me because I had so much shame. There's so many societal messages, especially around sexual assault, of like, don't talk about it. Don't share the specifics of what happened. Like, let's, keep it on a very high level. And unfortunately, that therapy really reinforced those messages, making me feel just so alone. I felt so hopeless, like nothing is going to help me. And if it does, it's going to be like a decade of suffering. And it took a lot to undo that. Like, it actually really, unfortunately, set me back.
Well, and this is a great segue to return to that book you mentioned earlier, The Body Keeps the Score. And for those who aren't familiar, this book by Bessel van der Kolk, which came out in 2014, and it's a very popular book. I mean, it's probably the biggest selling trauma book maybe ever. It's been a top bestseller in the field of trauma for many, many years. People love this book. A lot of people have found it helpful, therapists and people who have experienced trauma alike. And you wrote this Mother Jones article critiquing it and writing about some of your experience, but also some experts in trauma who sort of disagree with some of the tenets of the book. And I want to take some time now to dive into those, starting with what you're talking about, which is that one of the messages in the book is that trauma is always with you, right? There's kind of this underlying theme of like, once you've had trauma, it's always there. And so could you speak a little bit about that message and what's the problem with that?
Yes. The title for this book does a lot of work. The Body Keeps the Score. And it advances the idea that down to your every cell, you are permanently impacted by trauma. And a lot of readers really resonate with this idea, especially if you're in a very dark place, to feel like, this life-changing thing has happened and it's reflected in me and in my body. And that idea can be very toxic, where it's so common for victims of abuse and assault to feel like they have been damaged, like they have been irreparably changed, like they're disgusting. And unfortunately, this message of like you're changed on a cellular level can really play into that. And once you start to really dig into the particulars of what the book says and the examples of young women who are often from marginalized groups who have been victimized, it can lead to a lot of shame. And there's one passage in there where it talks about how it says like sexual abuse survivors have an entirely different developmental pathway. And it goes through like all of these changes in testosterone and these different chemicals. And it says like they don't have friends. They don't have friends of either gender. They are simply too weird. And that's just such a shocking thing for a book like that to say. And that was what led me to want to write the piece, because I was assigned this book by my therapist. And then you're reading messages like that. And it's pretty hard not to be disturbed by that, especially if this is a book that's sold more than 3 million copies and has been on the bestseller list, the New York Times bestseller list, for almost 6 years when you put it all together. Like, this is one of the most read books in America, not just trauma text, but book, nonfiction book, period.
And there's a section in it that you write about in the article called something like Addicted to Trauma or something like that. And you interviewed some trauma experts about that concept. What did they have to say about it?
Yeah, so this was a pretty wild story to report because I was speaking to experts, and I was speaking to Jenny Knoll, who is a leading sexual abuse researcher. And I was asking her about this part with the in addicted to trauma, and then with the young women having a different developmental pathway, not having friends, being too weird. And she was like, this totally mischaracterizes survivors. Like, sure, there's a few people who fit this bill, but this is not the majority. And she had been part of a 30-year longitudinal study of sexual abuse survivors. And so, what she was saying basically contradicted what the book said. And I went back and I was like, I wonder what the researchers who van der Kolk is citing would say about the way that he's using their work. And the passage that I had read to Jenny Knoll was from her study that she had been a part of. And so there's definitely this sense of that there's a lot of nuance that is being lost, that the kind of the worst case scenario is being summarized here, and that it's leaving out all of the stories of people who get treatment, of people who end up having amazing, wonderful lives. And like, of course, they're impacted by their abuse. Like, we all are impacted by the things that happen to us, but just that it's one particular way of looking at things that is not the full picture.
Yeah. That idea of being addicted to trauma is that people who have been traumatized are almost like seeking it out, whether consciously or unconsciously. And it places the responsibility like they are somehow addicted to something about how the trauma feels. I actually reread this chapter because I was like, I didn't remember it. And so I was like, I want to see what it says. And again, I think it has a little bit of that blame the victim type of feel to it, right?
Yeah. And the particular example that I wrote about was a young woman who was raped at gunpoint and who then went on to be sex trafficked as a child. And, her pimp was extremely violent with her. And the book is like, why does she keep going back? Like, it must be because she's addicted to trauma. And I find that example just so heinous. And the experts I spoke to, they're like, yes, it's very clear that people do tend to be re-victimized. But Jenny Knoll, who has studied this, is like, we don't know exactly why. Like, we have theories, but nobody really knows. And actually, when I spoke to van der Kolk to do the fact check for it, I asked him about some of these examples. And he told me that they're all like ones that he created, with the exception of like the opening anecdote and the case of sexual abuse survivors suing the Catholic Church, that they were all like composites that he had created from a bunch of people. So he made up this example of the young woman being sex trafficked as the example that illustrates the trend.
Yeah. And I think that this might be speculation, but that particular one was a composite. But often there are these, again, sort of underlying things happening in people's lives that might make them vulnerable, right?
Yes.
And there's a terrific quote in your Mother Jones article that the body that keeps the score stigmatizes survivors, blames victims, and depoliticizes violence, right? And so one of the things that you point out about the book repeatedly in your articles is about how it ignores some of these social forces that are allowing trauma, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. The book opens with the story of Tom, who was an American Marine in Vietnam, and his best friend died in an ambush. Many members of his platoon were injured or also died. And in his grief, he went on a rampage, murdering children, killing a farmer, raping at least one woman. And this is the anecdote that opens the book, where Tom is the victim. And there's no space dedicated to the people he victimized, to the parents who lost their babies, to the women who have been violated, like not even a line. And I think that really kind of frames an idea of power in the book and around who gets to be traumatized. And it sets it up as like that there's not really a difference between victims and perpetrators, right? If you're traumatized, and that your actions don't necessarily matter. And this line didn't make it into the piece, but I do write about the story of Aisha, who is a young woman who is living in a group home, and she had been gang raped. After she ran away from her group home, she was gang raped, and van der Kolk describes, it's a Monday morning and Aisha has been raped again, in kind of this way that it is saying that she had been victimized. So describing Aisha's experience, he wrote, trying to explain her behavior in terms of victim/perpetrator isn't helpful. And then a few sentences later, why she is so impulsive and lacking in self-protection, to describe what's happened to her. And this example is so galling to me because, first of all, she's in a group home. Why is she in a group home? You can make some assumptions around like being in foster care, being neglected or not taken care of. Second of all, the name Aisha is not a name you typically associate with upper middle class white girls, right? It's not a Stephanie or a Brittany, it's Aisha. And I think that line of ideas of victim/perpetrator aren't helpful. This is a gang rape. This is a serious crime. But that framing, I think, says a lot about the orientation of the book, where we're not going to look at structures of power. We're not going to look at why certain people commit crimes and get away with it. Instead, we're going to think about things through this lens of trauma, where you can be traumatized by your own actions committing more crimes.
Which is a theme we have on the podcast a lot of times, which is that really to help people with trauma, wouldn't it be great if we lived in a less traumatic world? I mean, I know that's very wishful thinking, right? But I mean, it's so true that I think, yes, of course, we need to provide support and treatment for people who have been traumatized, people who have PTSD, but wouldn't it be so great if the world was not traumatizing people left and right, and if we could affect change on that level?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. But it's also a classic from like Judith Herman, trauma and recovery of the kind of the final stage for a lot of people being activism.
yes.
And that it's often not enough to just heal your own wounds because that's continuing to happen to people.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a really important message that that any piece about trauma should put forward.
And I think that's the kind of the general idea here, right? Is that it's this individualized view of trauma that's sort of disconnected from these social and power systems that are happening, the context in which trauma is happening very often. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you gave an example of this already, but there are a lot of experts whose work is cited in the book who spoke to you about these inaccurate conclusions. And I think a critique I've often heard about the book is that he sort of mischaracterizes the research and sort of takes it, he goes beyond what the research actually says. And you really did a good job, I think, of fact checking in your articles. So can you maybe give a few more examples of that or just talk about that misuse of research in the book?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the big threads of the book is the idea that cognitive behavioral therapy doesn't work. And this is obviously a contentious issue. I think there's a lot of really good debate that is happening around how useful is it and how much does it even matter what therapeutic techniques therapists use versus just having the alliance in the relationship. But in one of the sections that's against cognitive behavioral therapy and that claims that it is not only useless, but often very harmful, I went in and I looked at what do the papers say? Does it match what's in the book? And I called those researchers. And one of them told me CBT should be the frontline treatment for trauma. Like, one of the claims in the book is like most people who do CBT don't get better. And it cites like the biggest study at the time of CBT from Polishner. And if you actually dig into the data, like, yes, only 40% of patients like drop their PTSD diagnosis. But that is a very big number of patients. And she told me these results are amazing. And as somebody who had PTSD myself, it's like, okay, a 40% chance of not meeting the criteria for this diagnosis at all in 10 weeks. It's not something everybody would sign up for, but that certainly is good numbers to me.
And I think one of the big problems with the book, and you write about this, is that it doesn't just offer a skeptical view of those cognitive behavioral approaches. It actually actively discourages people from getting those treatments like you were discouraged. Instead, you need to go to yoga, you need to wait and not re-traumatize yourself. And that's incredibly important to note that it is discouraging treatments that could be very helpful for a large number of people.
Yeah. So I combed through that section about cognitive behavioral therapy and the papers that van der Kolk cites. And one of his claims is that only about 1 in 3 participants with PTSD who finish the research studies show some improvement. And when I pulled up that paper, it was not an analysis of a bunch of research studies. It was just a few handpicked. And that was not what the number was at all. Van der Kolk also cited a meta-analysis in that footnote. And that meta-analysis, it gets at the question that we're trying to answer, right? How many people get better? And that meta-analysis found that 76% of the people who completed treatment benefited. Of people who didn't complete treatment, it was still more than half benefited. But 76% of people. So that is very different than 1 in 3. Right. And when I asked van der Kolk about this, he was like, that's basically the same. You're splitting hairs here. But that is a very different number. And the researcher who van der Kolk is primarily citing for that 1 in 3 number, he told me, as a frontline treatment, I don't think there is anything that is better for the treatment of PTSD than CBT. That was his quote to me. And one of the arguments is that it really steers people away from treatments that might help them. And I cited this editorial in Research on Social Work Practice And it argues that the influence and authority of van der Kolk and some of his peers are the main reason that people are not getting the highest quality treatment for PTSD. That editorial really argues that this effect on the culture cannot be overstated. And since the piece has come out, I've gotten so many emails from psychology professors and people who train therapists that tell me, like, we basically have to have a section on doing what people have learned from this book before people are even amenable to learning about these trauma-based or these evidence-based techniques.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I think that is so that it's actively discouraging a treatment that can help so many people is really upsetting to me. That people would read this book and think, ooh, that's not going to help me, that's bad. When for many people, well, and I've seen that. I trained in cognitive processing therapy, which is a type of behavioral therapy, which does exposure therapy. I've used written exposure therapy before. I have seen it happen. I have seen it change people's lives.
Yeah. I'm all about people having the evidence and then being able to make an informed decision.
Yes.
And I think my problem with this is that the evidence that's in these papers that are being cited is not what is being described in the book, at least in this area.
And certainly some people don't want to do exposure therapy. And I've had people with trauma histories who don't. We're not forcing anyone, but to know that that's an option. And you described this, I think, really well in your writing. Like, you're trying so hard not to think about it that you're thinking about it 75% of the day.
Yeah. And it's interesting because when I eventually went into prolonged exposure therapy, the first thing you learn is PTSD is caused by avoidance. It's caused by avoidance and it's maintained by avoidance. And so the key to getting over it is to stop avoiding things. And obviously that's one framework, that's one paradigm. It also is common sense to a lot of people, but it flies in the face of the idea that saying this will re-traumatize you, so you better not say it.
Right. And often you do see with PTSD, because of the avoidance, people's lives just get smaller and smaller and more narrow over time. And then they're missing out on the chance to really live fully.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big problem in a lot of standard therapy too, where I was having all of these side effects. Like I couldn't sleep. Like I was compulsively exercising. My life had become very small. And I don't even think my first therapist knew about it. The one who was encouraging me, like, keep working out 2-3 hours a day. I don't think she had any idea.
Yeah. And actually, that's a theme throughout your book, which is that you wanted to live and do all these things. And often people were so focused on this symptom, that symptom, this medication. And sometimes people missed, like, you're this very creative, smart person who wanted to go to college. And I don't know, people were maybe not focused on that as much as on trying to keep those symptoms down, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, now I know these terms like motivational interviewing, right? When I look back and I'm like, what could therapists really have done differently to help me? Motivational interviewing is probably the big one of just like, maybe I'm not using that term right, but like asking me, what do you want? What are your goals for treatment? Because I was not willing to stop harming myself for the goal of getting better. For some adult to tell me, oh, now you're better now, like, good job, great, I'm glad you're not doing this. But I was willing to do anything to achieve my goal. Mm-hmm. And I think that's how a lot of humans are. And you're kind of removing someone's dignity by telling them, like, you don't have the right to determine what your goals are for this treatment. Yeah. That really should be in the hands of the patient.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your experience with prolonged exposure therapy, because it is a very intense, you're not just riffing about your trauma memories, it's very structured. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people do find it to be a pretty intense and hard treatment to do. But could you tell us, just from the perspective of someone who went through prolonged exposure therapy, what was that like for you and how did it help you?
Yes. I did PE in a research setting. So it was a study. I had read some of the research around it. decided, okay, this is like the gold standard. And I think this is something that could really help me. And then I sought out private practice therapists who did it, but I couldn't really find anyone. So I ended up signing up to be a research subject. And it was very, very intense. I basically went to one session and I went on leave from work. I made the decision, like, I had good disability benefits and I was like, I can get more done this way.
I think you were
And
working at Google.
I was working at Google, yeah.
Right?
And yeah, exactly. And that was
Google.
yeah. So, like it was a very hard decision to go on leave, but I'm very glad I did, because I don't know whether it's how much of it was the therapeutic protocol or how much of it was being a research subject, but it definitely was like a full-time job for that 10 weeks, because every day there was like, homework for the in vivo exposure where I had to looked at photographs like from this trip. I like looked at reviews of the hostel where it happened. And that, was all very upsetting to me. I would be very upset. And then you're supposed to kind of sit with that upsetness, right? And then I had the few psychoeducation sessions, and then we started getting into the exposure sessions. And I just remember the first time the therapist went through the like, okay, with one foot in the past, one foot in my office, I want you to go through in first person present tense, everything you remember, smells, sights, bodily sensations, like that whole script. I mean, I felt like I was going to die. Like I felt like the building was literally going to collapse around me. I was so scared and I had no idea how I was going to do it. Like I was just absolutely terrified. Like I actually feel sick to my stomach now because it was so scary. And I was actually afraid that he was going to like be like, what you're telling me is like too bad. Like you have to leave. Like you've done something wrong by like sharing this. And so I think a big part of why I wanted to do prolonged exposure and why it ended up being a good option for me at the time I did it is that it was so structured. You're probably not supposed to go Google like your therapeutic protocol, especially as like a research patient. But I did. I was like, okay, what can I expect in every session? And it was being recorded so that supervisors could potentially watch it to make sure we were doing everything right. And that structure just gave me a lot of safety after having, years and years of negative therapeutic experiences. And like, I knew that I needed to talk about it, but it was so hard to do so. And it ended up being very affirming and making it a lot easier that my therapist would be like, okay, like, what does it smell like? And you're just like, as a patient recoiling and like, but then it's also like, okay, this person actually wants to know. Yeah. And I think it can be really easy in like therapy, especially when it's about like assault, to kind of just be like, well, it's not your fault. And we know it's not, but that's also very vague.
Yeah.
And it was very meaningful to me that in those psychoeducation sessions and everything, like that my therapist was not saying things that he couldn't back up with evidence. And like how our conversation was able to shift when it was like, okay, he actually knows what happened. And so we can actually talk about things in specifics.
Yeah, it's not your fault. It's like, that intellectually, but sometimes you don't really feel that experientially, especially when the message all around you is like, oh, you can't talk about that. People will not really give you the freedom to talk, like it's this shameful thing or something. And part of PE and other exposure therapies as well is teaching people that they can handle these big feelings. Like you're probably never going to think about that event that happened to you and just feel nothing or feel fine or, it's not a neutral memory, but you now know that you can approach that. You can, when it pops to mind, you'll be okay. And I think it's in acceptance and commitment therapy, we talk about how we often avoid really is the discomfort of these things.
Yeah. I was told at the very beginning, like, it's really important for you to get really upset. Like that is basically how this treatment works, is for you to go to like the most upset you can feel and then learn that it's okay, that you will survive that. And I think that that's like a very powerful lesson to learn. And I think that that's something that's really missing in a lot of our discourse around mental health right now.
Yeah. So I mentioned written exposure therapy, and I've used that and expressive writing with clients a lot. And I personally find writing to be a really helpful way to kind of ground myself and to process whatever's happening in my life. And I'm really curious writing the memoir, because you do write in detail about that event and other, traumas that you experienced over the course of your life, big T traumas and little T traumas, I would say. What was it like to write the memoir? I mean, it was very brave, I think, for you to be so incredibly open. It's a really powerful memoir, and your story, I mean, I just really appreciate you sharing it. Was it healing for you? Was it hard? Like, what was it like to put this on paper?
People love to ask me if writing, it was therapeutic. And I think if it was bad therapy. Maybe not like harmful therapy, but like ineffective therapy, where I was like working on the book for 5 years and before I sold it. And the first like 3 or 4 of those years, I was like, I had not gotten effective therapy, but it did motivate me to have to deal with all these things that I had been avoiding, and I don't think that the act of putting it on paper always did it. But I think it was really important that I went back and I spoke to all these people from my past. And I asked them, like, okay, what really happened? And I read like every single email I sent in high school, like 10,000 emails, literally. And I remember just finding these details and these things that often that I had done where I was like, I can't live with myself knowing that I did this. Like, I'm so embarrassed. I'm so ashamed. And then needing to kind of put all those pieces back into the full story and finding a way where it's like, okay, I understand why I did this. And I can like admit that like I shoplifted, right? That I stole this hat, that I like was mean to my mom, that I, was desperate and like begged a counselor to like help me do my college applications, even when she shut the door. And kind of creating that narrative of my whole life, I think actually really was helpful. And I really felt like, oh, I can't talk about this in my life until I've put it in a book. I think a lot of people feel that way. Like, I have to publish this book so I can tell people my secrets. And that's the one thing I would really change, because that was really when my life got different. It wasn't like writing it in my own diary, but it was being honest with the people that cared about me.
Yeah, because you didn't even talk about it like much. Like when you were at Harvard, you didn't tell, like people who knew you well at Harvard didn't really know. I mean, for the most part, right?
Yeah,
like about
totally.
your upbringing. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was like so ashamed. Like, I mean, Harvard really is it's a very upper middle class place, right? And it is not.
I went there I got my PhD there. We were having the Harvard connection earlier. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a certain place, right? And I think those narratives of resilience that we were talking about at the beginning of like, you must be stronger by all you've endured. I was like, I don't want to have to do that. Like, I don't want people to like look at me as some like guru when I'm still struggling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But to be that, here's the resilient one over here, you don't want that to be what people think of you. That's like your thing at Harvard,
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that would be so horrible. I'd rather just be from Minnesota, like the girl with purple hair from Minnesota.
I'm also really curious. We were talking earlier about the popularity of The Body Keeps the Score, and I know it has a very devoted following, right? I mean, people get very, very strong opinions about the book, and I'm wondering if you've received any of that in response to especially your Mother Jones article.
I received one email calling my story a hateful screed and saying that I was totally unqualified to write it. But that actually was the only real hate mail I got. My philosophy with this is that if somebody has been helped by this book, they don't care what I have to say. It literally doesn't matter to them. And the one thing that I would ask them to take away from it is to consider carefully who they recommend it to and what they say about it. And actually, I just got so many messages from therapists who are like, you have said what a lot of us are thinking. but that it's really hard or impossible to say. Because van der Kolk has been very, very successful. Kudos to him. He has a lot of power in certain circles. He has a lot of people who will defend him. And one of the experts I talked to, she avoids saying anything about him after doing a few videos because she's like, people will just become, she called it abusive. And there's a big sense of like, if you criticize this book, you are invalidating people's trauma. And that's kind of a problem if you can't talk about what research shows without it becoming personal.
Yeah, that is a problem, right? We should be able to have a healthy debate about these things. And I'm very interested, and I don't know if you have any thoughts on this or not, but certain books really get very, very popular, and certain people in our field have a lot of power. I'm actually thinking of The Anxious Generation, Jonathan Haidt's book that just came out maybe last year. That book has made an enormous splash, and we did a critical roundtable discussion of it back, I think it was in December that we released it, because a lot of researchers will say, well, it really goes beyond what the research is saying, but people don't seem to care. I mean, even my kid's elementary school is having like a PTA-sponsored book club to discuss it, and I'm sitting there thinking, I really hope, I might have to go just so I can represent all sides of it, because I'm not saying he's 100% wrong, but I'm saying he sort of goes beyond the research and people really have latched onto it. Why? Yeah. Emmy, why do these books gain such popularity? Tell me.
Okay, well, my friend Greg Epstein, who wrote the book Good Without God and is a humanist chaplain, he's the humanist chaplain of Harvard and MIT. And he would say that it's because they're basically religions, that they functionally serve as a religion in society. And there was a great piece on The Body Keeps the Score that said that too. It was, I wish I could remember the publication, but I think that they serve as like an origin story. It's like it answers the problem of sin. Like, why are young people struggling so much? Well, the anxious generation has an answer, right? Why are all of us struggling so much? The answer is trauma, according to The Body Keeps the Score. And I think many of us are really desperate for answers to these problems that are plaguing us. And in the absence of like believing that the problem is sin or the answer is God, we're looking for something else. That's my theory. And these people are basically preachers. They're preachers, right?
This was an incredible answer to this question. Let's try to find that article and we'll put it in the show notes, because I think that what you're saying is that it gives us like a belief system to kind of hang our hats on. And we actually talked about this in our critical roundtable. And I would say the same thing of this conversation today, which is there are so many complicated social problems underlying so many of these mental health issues and the adolescent mental health crisis that Haidt writes about. But it's much more pleasant to come up with a simpler solution or a simpler explanation.
Yeah. It gives you a sense of control.
Yeah.
Where if you're looking at, okay, we have all of these systemic problems that are leading to violence against women and children and, veterans being traumatized in war, those are really big problems that none of us can individually solve. But if you break it down into, oh, this person's traumatized, this person can go to therapy, it's a lot more controllable. And like at the end of my Mother Jones piece, I dive into prolonged exposure and evidence-based treatment. And in hindsight, I kind of wish I had focused a little more on these systemic issues and on people turning to activism and stuff like that. Because I do think that, when you're searching for an individual solution to a collective problem, it usually doesn't do the full trick. And I think we do need to be turning more attention to the ways that we need to live in a better world and the ways we can actually concretely do that.
Well, and this is a beautiful note to end on, because I know that you are going around speaking about mental health and doing this type of activism, which is putting these brave articles and books out into the world. Anything in particular you're working on next, or are you just enjoying your time as a new mom for a while?
I am definitely enjoying my time as a new mom. And yeah, I'm having a wonderful time continuing to write stories that hopefully we have a lot of social problems right now in the world, and to do my part to uplift voices. So,
well, I love it. Where can I and listeners who want to follow your future work, where can we follow you online and where can we find you?
The best place is my website at emmynietfeld.com. So if you see my name in the show notes, that.com. And I'm on Substack and social media very rarely.
Excellent. Well, I will be following you and your work and just very grateful to you for this conversation and for coming on the podcast and for the incredible work that you're doing. I really do think that your perspective is an incredibly important one to get out there to therapists and just the general population alike. So thank you, Emmy. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much, Debbie. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. You can now listen to our podcast ad-free by becoming a supporter on Patreon. You can link to Patreon on our website or go to patreon.com/offtheclocksite.
If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review and sharing this episode with a friend or an enemy who would enjoy it.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our fabulous newsletter on Substack. Or if you're still addicted to social media, find us on Instagram and LinkedIn.
We'd like to thank our rockstar production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
Now for the boring part. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.